going to be an amazing opportunity. I now am going to turn the time over to Dr. Kyle Barrington. Kyle, you're
Well,
now.
thank you very much for that generous introduction. As always, you do a great job with that. I'm going to have to definitely start taping that for nobody else and my kids, so they actually know what happens in this office up here. And again, thank you so much also for everybody who's attending here, but also LaShonda and your team for getting this all coordinated and getting everybody and all this put together. It's going to be a great series. For those who've had experience before going through what LaShonda and her team has put together with service to science and other kinds of activities like that, you know you're in for a treat, and with some really high-class individuals that are here to help your life become a little bit easier as we go through this process. As we talk about today, the agenda really is straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit about evaluation framework, why it's important, the benefits of the logic model, the components and the steps of that piece. And then really more importantly than anything, I think Nicole would agree, at the end of the day, this is your training. This isn't about something that, you know, I have a checkbox that I have to accomplish. If we get into it and the questions are there, we will answer every question. So as we go through that process, we want this to be yours. So as we go through that, please understand that. That's why we have the chat and we have moderators on board, and they'll make sure that they get us those questions as they arrive. So as we go forward, let's talk a little bit then and kind of refresh ourselves about the evaluation framework. Now, I think it's important to understand that when we talk about evaluation, sometimes I know people scratch their head and they get really disgruntled about evaluation. And it's, and some people, it's this nebulous thing that we do on the side. And for other people, it's the bane of their existence. But I will tell you this, evaluation is new. I mean, just think about it in human history, right? It wasn't that many centuries ago. We used to believe that the moon could be eaten. There were whole religions and societies based on that fact. It wasn't that long ago people said that iron ships could never float. And more importantly, that when they did float and sank, they could never be raised again, like a submarine couldn't exist. Or heavier than air flight could never occur. So if you're heavier than air, you can't fly. And then the one, you know, the most tragic, I think, in a lot of ways, is it used to be, particularly with medical science, that we used to believe that if a woman had problems, there was a whole science idea that it was because women had a floating uterus and all they had to do was get pregnant. That was scientific belief. And what allowed us to move away from that was the idea that somebody says, I challenge you on that assumption, let's evaluate it. And that's where evaluation really comes in. It's relatively new, but it really is important when we're dealing with people and public health. And we cannot think of a more important public health initiative than what the work that you do in your field today, particularly with underage drinking and substance abuse. So as we go through that process and the accompanying mental health issues that come with it. So our evaluation framework today, we're really just going to talk about a couple of things here. One of those pieces is that we are going to be looking at the description of the program here. And then we're going to focus on program and focus the evaluation design. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at that through the lens of evaluation logic models. And when we deal with a logic model, a lot of people have different ideas of what a logic model is. And there's even been some criticisms about logic model. And I would say some of the criticism is fair, but not entirely. So let's talk a little bit about that. When we deal with evaluation logic models, it really actually looks like a blueprint. Somebody came up with a need. The logic model did not define the need. And that's one of the criticisms, that somehow logic models are defining needs for communities. That could be further from the truth. The idea is you have a need, and every community does. So don't sit back in your community and think that your community is the only one with need. Everybody in this country and around the world has the same issues in just different capacities. And so as you go through that process, you are dealing with something that everybody else in every other community is dealing with. Normally, when you put in an application, if you were funded through SAMHSA, that's usually a competitive application process, and they didn't fund you because you had a need. Believe me, what they funded you for is because you had a solution. And what was that solution? You already crafted that in your application. And that really is your blueprint for success. You said, we're going to implement this program. We're going to implement that program to achieve this result, to meet this need. We're going to hire these people or pay for this service or implement this program. That's exactly what you have when you put in a kind of like a blueprint. I need a house. Well, the need is I don't have one. I need to have the land. I need to have the lumber. I need to have the sinks and the toilets. If I'm going to have a 4-bedroom house with a dog, I need to make sure I have places for that. Or later on, for some of you who are cat fans, you'll get the chance to see four rooms and a cat wrapped up later on. But as you go through this process, every logic model begins with the goals, Then you have those objectives on how we're going to achieve those goals, and then what activities we have to have. And once I have my goal and I know what objectives I'm going to achieve, and I have my activities outlined, then I can assess my outcomes. And that really is the case for your house. And I know I'm old, I've never built a house, but I've seen and heard and walked through the process when some of my family members did. And when you look at the blueprint, you go back to it over and over again. It's a living document. When something comes up, they make changes, they initial those changes, and now there's a new iteration of that blueprint. The same thing happens with your logic model. So if you're looking at a logic model and it hasn't been updated in the past 6 months, it's not a living document and you need to update it. Logic models are designed to be updated. They are not cast in stone. They are not religion. They are something that is a working tool for you to use. There are multiple definitions of those, and our moderator will have those at the end of this presentation. Obviously, there's a Kellogg, there's a Robert Woods Johnson. There's multiple ones. As long as you're using one that works for you and your funder, then you're doing well. But we're going to walk through some of the examples of what most logic models actually have. And as we go through that process, let's start and talk a little bit in the chat room about what is a logic model and what is it not. So let's start with what is a logic model. And let's go through chat here if I can find my chat control. And I don't see chat on my list just yet, but let's see. Here we go. Chat, 2 chats. Here we go. A logic model is a graphic representation of program inputs and outputs and outcomes. Excellent. A map towards outcome. Very good. Framework. Very good. A roadmap. Excellent. Mental health. Very good. A plan to address. Excellent. A visual of the theory or community of change. A planned answer. Very good. Excellent. Well, let's change topics. And what is it not? A logic model is not what? Thanks, Sheila. She keeps me on task, so that's good. A religion. I like it. Very good. I like the LOL after it. It's not an educated guess. Very good. Math. Very good. It is not. That becomes the evaluation plan, which comes later, but the logic model itself is not. And we got a cat in there too. I like that. All right. So as we go through that process, a couple of things to note as we move through it is several things about a logic model is that it really is that graphical roadmap. It is not a playbook. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3, but it is designed to allow you to be able to sit back and be able to say, hey, we have everything we need or we don't. And that's the priority of it, is when you go through the process, I always look at logic models as similar to kind of a recipe. The recipe is not the end product, but it tells you how you're going to get there. And along the way, it even is going to tell you, I need 3/4 of a teaspoon of this. I'm going to need a pound of that. I'm going to need to have this pieces of equipment. Like if I'm making a cake, I'm going to need a pan. I'm going to need an oven. I'm going to need a rolling pin. All those component parts to be able to make whatever my outcome is, I need to know ahead of time so I have it. Nothing worse than trying to make a dinner for someone and find out you're out of an essential ingredient at the last minute. So that's what the blueprint is designed to be in terms of the evaluation, is to make sure we have that all in place. So we're going to go right back to the chat box. What are some benefits of using that logic model? So if you have a logic model and you've used them before, and I think I read, according to LaShonda, something like 35% have done logic models before. So what do we use them for? What are some of the benefits? Guidance. Keeps everybody on track and informed. Particularly if you put that into action, absolutely. Flexibility, growth, and learning. Communication is key as well. So learning, communication, define goals. Shared goals, yep, it identifies indicators of progress. Very good. And that's essential. And they need to be shared identities and progress goals, indicators of progress goals. A clear starting point of moving forward. Excellent. Y'all are good. Excellent. All right. Well, that gets us a starting point. So let's talk a little bit as we go through there. Helps the organization and organize your needs and define your expectations. Absolutely. So a couple of things that we came up with, and we start talking about the benefits of a logic model are these, and you got all of these, just about every one of them. So as you move through this process, congratulations to everybody on the call who helped in that chat room. But it definitely develops your understanding. It's meant to be a high level understanding, not detail oriented. It's not the playbook, but it's that framework and that high level. The most important for me, though, is the second one. It helps expose those assumptions. There are assumptions out there that something is going to work with no evidence of it. And so one of the things that an evaluation logic model is designed to do is to put practice and to put definitions around those assumptions so that they become explicit. And I will just tell you this. When I first got into the field and we wanted to reduce truancy in school, I had 27 different teachers in a room, and I had 27 different definitions of what tardy was. Every teacher had a different definition. Some of them was they had to be in my room at their desk with their book open, pen ready, paper, and everything put away. Another one said, well, hey, they just had to be at their desk. Another person said, no, they could just be in their classroom. Another one said, I just have to see them walking in the classroom. Another one said they just had to be in the hallway. Still others said as long as it was a minute or so afterwards, they could still be counted. So as you go through the process, we have to make sure then when we deal with evaluation logic models and we're dealing with public health issues that we expose and make sure that we make implicit those assumptions. But it helps monitor progress, makes us and really helps us restrain from overpromising. You definitely want to underpromise and overdeliver. That same kind of making sure here that we're not overpromising results. It facilitates project reporting because it should say, hey, we're going to report these every so often, 3 months, 6 months, once a year. Promotes that communication, and then serves as that evaluation framework so everybody is part of the solution and part of the evaluation and not just a subgroup of individuals behind a computer screen. So important parts about the key parts about a logic model are the priorities, the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes. And priorities really are already in your application. If you are using a logic model and you are creating it for your application you're about to put into SAMHSA or to another funder, I would say you're doing it backwards. Normally, the way you'd want to do that is you come up with what your needs are through your community needs assessment and using the strategic prevention framework in that capacity. Then you go in and you say, okay, what are my risk and protective factors? We're going to talk about in a minute. And then you come up with your solution. So it's your needs, your goals, and your objectives. Once you have those, your logic model should identify what inputs you have. And the way we look at inputs are the things you have to have: supplies and personnel. In this case, we may need volunteers and funded materials. And then we have outputs. Once I have the volunteers and they're trained, what are the outputs? Well, they're going to deliver X number of sessions of SOS, or they're going to do this many sessions of CAST, or this many social host events. These kinds of things become the activities. Once I do all that, then I get to my outcomes. And my outcomes then are what I'm going to be able to track and measure. And we'll talk a little bit about those, particularly Nicole will get into some of those. So as we move into that process, that's kind of where we are in terms of the overall logic model and what a logic model should look like. So when we start looking at the step one of, in this scenario, in terms of our logic model, we're looking at what is the problem and how do we know it's a problem? That should already be defined. And one of the criticisms I get when I do these presentations is, well, the logic model defines the problem. No, the logic model just details the problem. It doesn't define it. You've already done that through other work. And how do you know it's a problem? Well, one of the things that you should also have in your logic model is what does that? Identify the data sources, and you're getting that from that application. And what are the consequences of the problem? We have increases in mental health, anxiety, increased substance use. We have dropout rates. We have truancy. Those are things that have already been identified in your community as a need. And the logic model is just articulating it at a very high level framework. What factors contribute to that problem? Risk and protective factors we'll talk about in just a second. And then what gaps exist in addressing the problem? Because remember, if you have no gaps in your community, then what is the funding used for? Right? So at some point in time, you got to say we have this need, we have this risk or protective factor that needs to be influenced, and we have no means of doing that. So that's why we need this resource. Now, the other thing I will tell you as you go through this, and if you're in this field, you need to understand it, is that the people with the money have just that. They have the money. They don't have the wisdom. You have the wisdom, right? If somebody knew how to solve underage drinking and were really wanting to solve it, they would. They would tell you what to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to give you this shot twice over 24 hour or over a 28-day period. And after that, we're going to see a reduction. Nobody has that plan for underage drinking or mental health. We've been fighting this for thousands of years, since basically, the beginning of mankind, man and womankind. So as you go through it, know what you're doing is a challenge. And because of that challenge, you're going to hit obstacles as you go along. And a way to avoid those obstacles and at least be able to address them and to share that with those who fund it and say, hey, this works or this doesn't, which is just as important, is that evaluation logic model. So we're going to go back to a chat room. We're going to talk a little bit about risk and protective factors. And let's talk a little bit about risk factors here. What are some risk factors that y'all know of? Just in regular life, what are some risk factors? I see a question there. We'll get to that. Let's go back to real quickly about what is a risk factor. Social groups, right? So social groups, depending on the social group, can be a risk or protective factor, but I would agree with you. They definitely can be a risk factor. Low parental involvement, absolutely. Easy access to substances. Not wearing a mask, I saw that one coming through. Very good. Low perception of harm, absolutely. If I don't believe it's harmful, why would I avoid it, right? Normative beliefs. Trusting human, yep, yes. A lot of cases we do have that trusting process. Divorce or single parent families, absolutely. We know from data there are many single family and divorce families that thrive, but the data tells us that a substantial number struggle, particularly when we get into economic and socioeconomic statuses and so forth. Excellent. Okay, very good. Family issues, mental health, genetics, all right. Not well researched idea, absolutely, right? We talked about a few of those. All right, what's a protective factor? Parental involvement. Active parental involvement is definitely a protective factor. Strong social support, very good. Resiliency, yep. Positive relationships, education, stable family unit, community involvement, absolutely. Parks, right? Ability to access extracurricular school activities. Religiosity, very good. Excellent. Y'all are right on top. So as we go through this process, we know that every community is got a definition and a combination of risk and protection factors, right? So one of the things that you're going to do in your narrative or in the grant application in which you're trying to solve a problem in your community is you're going to identify those risk factors, and then you're going to identify protective factors. So let's talk a little bit about what each of those are. Now, many of you have already seen this, but for those who may be new to substance abuse prevention or misuse prevention, as well as mental health, let's talk a little bit about what risk factors are. And also, if you're new to that, welcome and thank you. We need everybody in the field, and we need more people in it who are high quality and dedicated to moving the field forward. But a risk factor really is just a characteristic at the biological, psychological, family, community, everything we kind of mentioned earlier, cultural level, that precedes and is associated with a higher likelihood of a problem outcome, right? Divorce, low social attachment, not connected to school, high truancy rate, no access to parks. Those kinds of things are definitely areas in a community that are considered a risk factor. So as we go through that process, one of the things that's important to understand is every community has these. And just because you have maybe more than one doesn't mean your community is at any worse or any less advantaged than another community. What you're really looking for is what's the solution to reducing that risk factor or improving the situation around that risk factor. The same can be said for a protective factor. A protective factor is a characteristic, right, at the biological, psychological, family, community, culture as well, that is associated with a lower likelihood of problem outcome. That reduces the negative impact of a risk or problem outcome. And those could again be, if you have a protective factor, engaged family units, active community involvement, access to parks, pets are some in many cases, access to the religion of your choice. Those kinds of accesses and pieces in your community and in your family structure lead to better outcomes. And so those are the things we want to embrace and we want to enhance. So as we go through these processes, these are kind of things that we look at. We look at those risk and protective factors, and they should be identified in your logic model. And that logic model should say, we are going to improve this risk factor by this, or we're going to strengthen this protective factor by doing Y. Excellent. And before I turn it over to Nicole, let me talk real quickly about this example. And when we start talking about SOS, this is a evidence-based program designed around suicide prevention. It's a huge issue, particularly in the pandemic, and we're going to use this only as an example. When you actually, if you move into the next part and you get into the second part of the logic model series here, you'll get a case study and you're going to tear that apart. And if you move to the third, we're going to use your data. So as you go through the process, that's the important piece, is you'll get a chance to see it as a kind of a universal case study. But at the end of it, if you get to that third section and you're into that 5 hours of technical assistance, we use your data and help work on your logic model for your program. But like LaShonda said, only one program per organization. So get together with everybody who may want one. But in this case, we have the SOS prevention. The key risk factors include suicidal thoughts and depressions, no awareness. That's usually huge, particularly with middle school and high school students. Several diverse programs have been implemented. And that's the other thing. We have so many programs, people lose track about which ones work. And eventually, because there's so many, people begin to believe they're ineffective. And then many of these programs are complex and long-term. But the more complex and long-term they are, the more important it is that we have a valid and reliable logic model. With that, I'm going to turn it over to logic model guru, Nicole. And so as we go through that process, she's going to start talking about defining steps here. I'm going to release the screen. And while Nicole is getting set up for her part of that, I'm going to see if there's any questions.
Kyle, there was a question.
Sure.
The question is, what's the difference between a logic model and a strategic plan?
Very good. And in my definition of a strategic plan, it's the overarch of all the issues that you're fighting, right? And so the way to look at a strategic plan, and you can see behind me, I got the USS Arizona. I'm a kind of a military buff, and I got a girl. One of my daughters is actually in the Army. But strategy and that strategic plan is all the issues that you can encompass, and you need a plan that allows you to address if you're going to be attacked from the right flank or the left flank, those kinds of things. That's the strategies that you have, and it gives you that blueprint across all of it. A logic model is a subset of that. You take one piece. Well, if they come from the right, or in our case, we have all these issues and risk and protective factors in our community. That's my strategic plan. I know all these things I have to address. What am I going to address first? I create a logic model for that. And that becomes kind of the tactics that I'm going to use to address that strategic plan. So I have the strategies. I need to reduce underage drinking, and I need to reduce anxiety. So the way I'm going to do that in adolescent kids who use drugs to offset anxiety is I'm going to put in SOS as an example. And here are all the steps. Nicole, you want to add something to that?
No, I thought that was great, Kyle. Thanks. It's a good question.
Yes.
So now we're going to move into talking about goals, and goals are very broad, and we'll get into objectives later, and those get more specific. And we'll move through this section a little bit quicker. The needs are very important, and so we wanted to make sure we spent a lot of time going through that and talking about risk and protective factors to get everybody on the same page. So we'll move through this a little bit faster. So once you have described the need for your program, you're going to want to develop one or more goals, and that will describe what you want to see changed over time. And your goals describe the intended long-term outcomes of your initiative in really large, broad terms. So really the question is, what long-term change does your program intend? So what do you intend to do over time? The goal should be tied directly to your overarching needs statement. So for example, if we say, well, our overall needs statement is that we need to reduce underage drinking, then our overall goal would be, well, we want to reduce underage drinking in our community, right? So more specifically, let's say you identified that you had a high rate of alcohol use among your 13 to 15-year-olds in your community. A relevant goal would then be to reduce your alcohol use among 13 to 15-year-olds. And similarly, your goals might be tied to consequences. So let's say that the consequences of alcohol use among those 13 to 15 is early initiation of sexual activity or a greater likelihood of school dropout. And then those might be your goals. So to reduce early sexual activity or school dropout. So all of that sounds kind of obvious, right? But that's really what a logic model is. It should sound obvious. It's logical. And these different facets are so well linked. We'll see that later when we talk about the overall logic model and how your overall goals are going to be tied back to your priorities. And it's just a really nice way to put all the puzzle pieces together. Um, so clear goal statements are really important for making sure everyone involved in your program is on the same page and heading in the same direction. So I saw that as one of the benefits someone identified, making sure that everyone is on the same page is a huge benefit of the logic model. And that's really what your shared goal is going to be. So now let's get back to our SOS as our example. And SOS, the goal statement is going to be to reduce suicidal behavior among high school students. And these are going to be grades 9 through 12 in 3 school districts. So notice here, we don't say by how much, we don't say when, we don't get super specific. This again is our broader reach with the goal. And then we're going to move into getting more specific with our objectives. So what specific changes do you anticipate will result from participation in your program? And some of you may have heard of the acronym SMART in other trainings you've been in. This is a great acronym to really keep us on track in prevention and other fields. So we want it to be specific, identifying what will change. We want it to be measurable. So how are we going to reduce it by this much? Are we going to change it from this to this? Is it directional? Are we increasing or decreasing? And then we want it to be achievable, right? We don't want to set an objective that we can't accomplish. So we want to make sure this is feasible and useful. We also want to make sure it's realistic. The resources are available. We have the funding, we have the training, we have the capacity within our staff to carry this out. And then we also want to know by when. So is it going to be next year that we complete this objective? Is this a 5-year objective? So all of those are very important to make sure that you've captured all those elements in your objectives. So for SOS, our examples would be, so here we've got the directional, right? To increase the percentage from baseline, so that's where we're going from, of students in grades 9 through 12. So we specifically identify the population too, the who report improvements in knowledge and beliefs about depression and suicide. And then another directional example here to increase the percentage from baseline of students in grades 9 through 12 who report feeling able to seek assistance for depression. So this is where we got a lot more specific from that original goal. So you can see we've got a little bit of math in here, but not a lot. We're increasing percentages. We're stating that that's from baseline. We're definitely identifying our population more specifically and identifying those measures that we're going to look at. And then we get to our long-term objectives. So our long-term objectives are going to be more tied to those actual overall things we want to see happen that take a lot more time. So our short term is what's going to get to the long term. So for SOS, we have 2 long-term objectives. We want to increase from baseline the percentage of students who report seeking help for depression or suicide. And they also want to reduce from baseline the percentage of students who report a suicide attempt or suicidal ideation during the past 3 months. So you can see how these short and long-term objectives are related to their risk and protective factors that we identified earlier. And if you recall, the risk factors included suicidal ideation, depression, lack of understanding or awareness of signs of suicide, and reluctance to seek help. And so that's how everything is tied together. So by focusing on those risk and protective factors with the short term, then we can get to the point with our long term where we're actually reducing those percentages in terms of suicide attempts. So now I am going to actually turn it over to Kyle, but we're going to take any questions that you all might have. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Hi, Nicole. We do have a question. The question is from Emily Barnes. It's, at what point in writing objectives do you state how the objective will be measured? So again, the question is, at what point in writing objectives do you state how the objective will be measured?
So I think it kind of, at least for me, it kind of happens all at once, but you kind of have that idea of, okay, this is what's going to lead us to our goal. And then you start using that SMART objective kind of acronym to help you walk through that. So I just kind of follow that. So I want to make sure it's specific. I want to make sure it's measurable. So you can go back and take some time to look at the data that you already have, and look at your baseline, and then decide how much can I increase that by. And that really leads more to when we get into those actual measures later on with the evaluation and the evaluation plan. The objectives are laying that out to say, hey, we're going to take this and we want to increase it from baseline to this. So that is part of that objective process. There's not really a rhyme or reason into how that all plays out. You just need to make sure you've got all the components. So sometimes that process works a little differently depending on the group you're working with and the process that you're using. So I don't know, Kyle, do you have anything else to add there? And
Yeah, what I definitely echo what you say. It definitely is going to depend on the group that you're working with and what their goals are at the long run. But what I normally do is the objective has everything in it except the measurement piece. That becomes the outcome. So my objective, for example, is to reduce suicidal ideation by 30%. And then my outcome is to reduce suicidal ideation by 30% as measured by the CAS suicidal ideation survey. And that's where I identify all the kind of the nuanced piece of how the outcome is going to be measured. But my objective and my outcome should be linked. And the only thing that my objective has in my logic models are going to be the actual tool that I'm going to use to measure it. And kind of as that point in time, obviously that objective needs to be mapped to that. And if you are always struggle, and Nicole, we've had this before when we've done logic model trainings, what's the percentage change that you're experiencing? Well, that should actually be in the evidence. If you're using an evidence-based practice, they should say, hey, our experience is if implemented with fidelity, you'll see a 50% reduction or a 30% increase. So you want to go back and look at that and say, okay, in my environment, what's different that may either increase or decrease that rate? The other thing to remember, and Nicole's exceptional mentioned this several times as well, is that this is a living, breathing document. And so if you put in there 30%, but you achieve 25, that's still a good goal. The question is okay, what do we need to reduce it to 25 next time? Or what happened that didn't allow it to be that higher level? So again, it's a living document. It's always going to be updated. Nicole, did that make sense to you, or did I confuse people, do you think?
no, I think that was great.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, Nicole's my balancer. She always does, right? I kind of get a little excited around here, those kinds of things. So, all right. Well, what we're going to move then, unless LaShonda, any other questions?
Those are all the questions, you all.
Excellent. So as we go through the process then, let's talk a little bit about inputs. And inputs are one of my favorite things, right? So as we go through this process, I love logic models. I've been teaching my kids about logic models. We had them do logic models. They wanted to go to on a trip. I took them to Washington, D.C. Each of my girls, I got a chance to take them one-on-one to Washington, D.C. But they had to do a logic model of what they wanted to see, what was the outcome. And I had them put a percentage increase in gain of knowledge. And so one of my girls was really interested in aviation. So she wanted to go to the aviation museum and she wanted to check Amelia Earhart. And so one of the things is I wanted to increase her knowledge around female pilots and female experience in aviation. So that was my goal. We had that as an outcome. So we had all these activities. We had to go to the museum and we had to specifically go to the aviation department and look for Amelia Earhart, right? And all the paraphernalia and all the movies and all the videos around that. And we had to watch them. So as you go through that process, those are all inputs. right? At the end of the day, I had to take her there. I had to show her the stuff. I had to give her that material in order for, in my mind, the outcome to be achieved. So inputs are really the things you have, right? You got to buy, you got to purchase, or you got to secure. Could be volunteer efforts as an example. So when we start talking about step 4 and identifying those inputs, it's really, again, I go back to recipes. It's probably because I'm hungry all the time. But at the end of the day, I think it's more along the lines, my wife is a good cook, and my daughter, my youngest daughter especially, is a great baker. And so she has taught me a lot about different spices and different seasonings. And so as we go through this process, those are all inputs and be able to make that cake that my daughter loves to make. She makes a great chocolate ganache cake. She now has gotten to the point where she used to make it for daddy. Yay. Now she only makes it for her boyfriend. And so I'm always trying to figure out how often he has a birthday. And we're trying to celebrate like every month of their dating. Hey, this is your 7th month. Doesn't he get a cake today? Right. And I get a slice. So as you go through that process, right, that's these kinds of inputs. So when we start talking about inputs, everybody's got to have them. How many things do you have to buy? How many staff do you have to hire? And again, that should come from the evidence-based strategy you selected. They're going to tell you one teacher, for example, in this strategy can work with 30 kids. So one teacher equal 30 participants. They have to be trained. So, and they need to be certified. So one certified teacher hired, they need to be trained, and then they're going to work with 30 kids. Well, what happens after they work with 30 kids, right? That becomes the outcome. And one of the things that's great about our field is it's evolving. It used to be all we cared about was the McDonald's sign, right? Now, I used to work for McDonald's. It was one of my first jobs I ever had. And they used to have a sign out front that changed X number of million served, right? 27 million served. Then it became billion served. Now they don't even have the sign, so many have been served. But as you go through that process, those are just right outputs. Just the number of burgers served really doesn't tell you what the impact was. How many people liked it? How many people thought it was the best burger ever? How many people say I would go to McDonald's as my first choice in a new city? None of that. It's just served, right? So we used to call that butts and seats when I was first growing up in the evaluation side, right? They didn't care about the outcome. They did. For example, today, what are we looking at right now? We got 84 butts and seats, right? Minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So about 78 people, right? Probably about 4 of them haven't been on for a full 30 minutes. So I would say right now 74 people are actively engaged in this process. But nobody would have cared 20 years ago whether or not you got anything out of it. Today we do, because guess what's going to happen here at the end of this presentation is you get a chance to evaluate, right? And so as you go through that process, we're going to find out, did butts and seats equal to change or improvement in knowledge or even liking of the presenter, right? And if I have offended you in any way, shape, or form, my name is Kyle Barrington, blame me. If you have learned anything about this presentation, I'm an associate with OU, give them all the credit in the world, right? So as you go through that process, that's kind of the beauty of where we are now is we have this full range of pieces, but we have to have the inputs. Today, LaShonda had to say, hey, on this day, I got to have this support staff. I have to have Zoom technology ready to go. I had to have Nicole online, and I had to keep Kyle as quiet as possible, right? So those are all things that she had on her to-do list. So let's talk a little bit about SOS and their inputs. One of the things that you had to do if you're going to implement SOS, and again, we're using this as kind of that case study for this event only, just kind of give everybody a kind of an open eye as to what that looks for, is you develop teaching materials. So they had to be developed or purchased, the video and discussion guide. You need to identify and adapt self-screening tool, right? Self-reported screening tool. Most of them are now available, but the publishers typically have them. I need to train my clinical staff to implement the program, and I need to obtain parental permission. All of those become my inputs. Right. So as I have those inputs in place, then these kinds of things allow me to move forward and to start seeing outputs that lead to outcomes. So once I have all this, how many people do I train? How many kids are enrolled? How do I select them? How many times do they meet? And once they meet, what happens if they don't meet often enough or some people start dropping out like Kyle doesn't show? What do? Those are all parts of those output processes. So SOS has some very specific inputs. And one of the things that we look at is we look at these outlying activities and we have these critical components. Now, there may be thousands of things that you really think you have to have, how many pens, how many pieces of paper, but really there's just some essential critical elements to every evidence-based program that we have. And so one of those things is going to be staff. Do I have the right staff? If I don't have the right staff, do I expect the right outcome? And this is really critical. In a lot of cases, our evidence-based programs in schools require certified teachers. And if they do all the staff we hire, are they truly certified teachers who know how to teach? Right? Do we have the right material delivered at the right time and in the right format, right? Fidelity pieces to it. So did we buy it? And did you get Kyle? And then Kyle thinks he knows everything, so therefore he starts changing stuff up. Did you evaluate to make sure, right, that Kyle's doing things with fidelity? Right. So as you go through there, these are the critical pieces of your program that have to be implemented. And in a lot of cases, one of the things that you want to make sure of is that you're targeting or identifying the right population. So if I'm only dealing with people who have no suicidal ideation issues, that may help them, but am I really addressing the population that is most at risk? And that's the other critical component. Am I identifying and am I recruiting and am I able to retain those people who are going to most benefit from this program? And that's essential. So as you go through the process, step 5 then is outlining those real activities that you deem to be essential and critical. And they shouldn't be an assumption, right? One of the things we're talking about is we want to get away from assumptions. What this really should be is these should be things that the evidence points you to. Whoever wrote your grant, whoever was involved in that process, identified a program, evidence program, right? You're implementing that now. You should be the owner and you should be the caretaker of that program and know exactly what are the essential elements and to make sure your program has those. And that becomes essential to making sure we have success. So as an example of SOS activities here, we need to get those students, we need to recruit them and get the parents to sign off, and then we need to show them a video. These are part of those activities or outputs, if you will. We need to conduct discussions. We need to discuss and model self-seeking strategies. That's hard for kids, by the way, in anything, as you know, right? Getting help with substance abuse or saying, I feel depressed or anxious and not feeling like it's their fault or that they're weak, right? That seeking help strategy. We need to distribute and collect student administered screening forms, right? That becomes part of our outcomes because that's going to be baseline. What do you start with and what did we end with? We need to follow up with screening results and further assess students who screen positive. And we need to contact parents to make sure that treatment referrals for students are necessary. Now, these same kind of activities apply to almost any evidence-based program. You got to get not only the people hired, but them doing the work. And that's part of your evaluation logic model. And one of the things that we do with activities and then outcomes is we do a return on investment. How much money did it cost just to get to serve 30 students? Return on investment. Then of every positive outcome, what was the cost? And if you have a significant difference, if you have the cost of getting butts and seats is $300 a student, but an outcome is $3,000, then there's a disconnect. So as you go through the process, that's all laid out for you in your logic model. Now, you don't have to do the math. Somebody else can do that for you. But once you agree, yeah, if we're doing 30, we should see a 50% reduction and you're only getting a 10% reduction, you need to start going back and say, what aren't we doing right? Is it fidelity? Is it Kyle didn't show the video, or are we not recruiting the right students? So that becomes your activities. And if you have it written out in your logic model, I can assure you as a program director like I was for many years, it will help you when people come to you to complain. And you're going to get it. They're going to complain about, oh, well, somebody said this or somebody did that. And you're going to be able to say, hey, we all agreed. And again, I go back to the definition of truancy. One of my biggest things around this is when we started doing recidivism rate. Try to get law enforcement people and school district people together and define recidivism. Is it arrests? Is it number of times they're put in jail? Is it number of times a civil penalty is assessed? Or is it adjudications, meaning they were found guilty by a group of their peers? Those are discussion points, right? So as you go through these processes, that's why you want to make sure you have all of this ladled out. All right, so let's talk a little then about the process then as we go through here. And the evidence-based program you select should have a theory of change that says, hey, this is how our program works. And as we go through that process then, this is what it looks like. So as we move through this piece, evaluations are guided by theory, right? Now, that's an example of one of my daughter's ganache cakes, right? Chocolate ganache cakes. Now, this isn't hers. I got this off the web, and there's a link to it appropriately, but it looked almost identical to that, except I would say it looked slightly better. It looked better on my plate when I had cut it. But as you go through that process, when we deal with cakes and those kinds of things, there's a process in place about why we do things in particular order. And it's also why we don't change fidelity. And I'm going to ask Nicole to tell a story about her experience, what happened when somebody in college decided they weren't going to follow fidelity, because I think this is a hilarious story. Nicole, you got a second to share that?
Sure. So I was making a lemon meringue pie with a baking partner, and he, unbeknownst to me, decided to put salt in the pie instead of sugar, and asked the teacher to take a bite when we were done, and yeah, it didn't taste good. So the recipe is really important.
Yes. Oh, and would you say that he didn't follow the fidelity?
Exactly.
Yep. Yep.
He did not have fidelity to the intervention, so
Excellent. Very good. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Nicole.
no
So,
problem.
and as we go through here, that's one of the important things about what a logic model does, and then following the theory of change that evidence-based practice has. And that should be telling us, here's what we have to do first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And I know we're all experts in our field, and I know we all know, in our heads that we can do things better. But it is important to understand that the evidence-based programs we're implementing are implemented in a way that was found to be successful. And if we change even one thing, like salt to sugar or sugar to salt, or baking soda to baking powder, or teaspoons to tablespoons, like my daughter, when she first started cooking, wasn't quite clear and found out that cumin in tablespoons is much more powerful than cumin in teaspoons. And so as you go through that process, these are lessons learned. We don't have time in our public health world, in the limited amount of time we have with the kids that we're dealing with, or even our adults, to be able to guess. So we know what works and we need to follow that plan, and that becomes somewhat of this theory of change. And we concentrate attention and resources on the key programmatic aspects. We try to make sure that that theory of change facilitates the understanding of how these strategies are supposed to work. We make those assumptions explicit by defining it, like what sugar is versus salt, and no, we're not changing it, and influence both public and policy and popular opinion, right? A lot of things we do, we're not going to get liked at first, because if everybody liked what we were going to do, they would already be doing it, right? So one of the things it is, we are going to be challenging assumptions at the public and policy level. So that's part of what we're going to have in regards to change in theory. So one of the things that looks at here then is we have this example of SOS theory of change. And the first one is that they're looking at is we have to have people stand out and be okay with being different. Yes, I'm having anxiety and I'm going to tell you that I have anxiety, or I'm not feeling well. And it's okay for me to do that because, number one, I've been trained and taught that that's okay. And then I have the social norms around that says, yeah, it's good. Like the picture here about modeling pro-social behavior, right? On an airplane, they model it every time you get on a plane about how to use that mask. Right. And if you try to change up that pro-social model, that will detrimental that might be, right? So you have to have support, not just talk about it, but actually demonstrating it. And in this case, also, you get others around you in that social network. And that's why when we earlier talked about it, social networks and social groups showed up both as a protective and as a risk factor, depending on what group it is and what their attitudes are, right? If it's an attitude of you don't ever seek help and you self-medicate, that's usually a risk factor. If it's a group that is open to support and loving and caring and looking for the best out for everyone, that's usually more of a protective factor. So as you go through here, that was SOS's theories of change. Stand out, changing the social norms, modeling that pro-social behavior in the school, and making sure you had social support systems around it. So as we go through that process, that's where we stand out with that SOS piece. All right, at this point in time, I'm going to hand this back over to Nicole as soon as I finish up identifying our participants here. And as we go through that process, one of the things that's important to note, we used to call these identified participants or targeted participants. We moved away from the term targeted. Nobody wants to have that label on them anymore. So we have identified populations. And so as you go through these pieces, those are participants and people that you actually need to serve and are designed to be served. And a lot of programs make the mistake of not identifying the appropriate population, and that results in lower outcomes. If I'm really working for kids who report high levels of social or suicidal ideation like SOS, I need to make sure I do that screening first and only include those students who are deemed appropriate. All right, I'm going to turn this back over to Nicole. And Nicole, please let me know if I missed something or if I made something unclear, or LaShonda, likewise.
I'm
Sure.
going to assume everything is clear to everyone at this point because we have no questions in the chat box as Nicole shifts into her screen.
Excellent. Thanks, LaShonda.
All right. So now we're going to talk about Looks like I'm on the wrong screen here. Sorry, y'all. Okay, we're at our participants. So we are looking at the example now from SOS. And so what I'm going to do here is just kind of walk you through, because I know it kind of can be confusing sometimes when you are looking at participants. We often think of those that are actually receiving the service as the participants. And in terms of a lot of the work we do, we may have people that are actually doing the training, that are also considered participants. So in this case, we have our school teachers in the who column, our clinical staff, and they are showing videos. So this is what they're doing. They're conducting discussion. They're modeling help seeking, distributing and collecting self-administered assessments, following up on those assessments, and making those referrals. And then with to whom are usually the folks we think of often as participants. In this case, since this is a suicide prevention program, these are service recipients. They may have received a screening. There may be parents that have been given a referral for their student or their child. Community mental health providers that are involved. And so we have a wide variety here in this case of participants, and that often happens in prevention. So I just want to make that distinction because we often think of, oh, we're in prevention, we're going to go to do a training and we have participants, but it's also the folks that we're training to do training, the folks that are showing or facilitating groups. So those are all part of the participant pool. And now we're going to get on to talking about outcomes. So with outcomes, similar to those objectives where we had our short term and our long term, for outcomes, we also have short term and long term, and we can also have intermediate. And so our short term outcomes, these are really the immediate program effects that you expect to achieve. So these are usually your changes in attitudes or beliefs, or risk or protective factors, and these results from the program activities. And those are often going to align with your short-term objectives. And then we have the intermediate, and these are the effects you expect to achieve, which are often related to behavior or skills. So these outcomes often align with your medium or intermediate term objectives or goals. So in terms of behavior, it might be, for example, with underage drinking, we might see changes in behavior with drinking and driving, let's say, where someone is going to, you know, have a designated driver. So that's a change in behavior. The short term would have been we're increasing that perception of harm, let's say, from drinking and driving. And then our long term, we're going to have less, accidents related to drinking and driving. So that's an example of how those all relate to each other. The short term feeds into the intermediate, which then helps you achieve your long term objective. And these are really the ultimate effects of the program. So these are usually like changes in social conditions. So for our example, we'll show you in a bit, that's going to be to reduce suicide. So that's kind of how that's all laid out. And I love the stair step example because it really is about when we achieve the short term, then we can work on our intermediate. When we achieve those, we can then move on to our long term and hopefully achieve that long-term goal that we set. So that's how that all plays together. So in our example with SOS, in the short term, we're going to have improved student and parent recognition of the signs of depression and suicide. So notice this is a knowledge change. So the short term usually is changes in knowledge or attitudes. And then in the intermediate term, we have increased student help-seeking behavior. So again, this is behavior change. Our intermediate term is going to focus on behavior. And then for our long term, no youth suicide attempts or suicide. So again, that is a behavior change, but that's a long-term change where we're not going to see those suicide attempts. And follows back to our overall long-term objective of reducing suicide attempts. So I hope you see how those are all linked together and related. These are all likely to lead to those intended outcomes, and that's really our goal. So now I'm going to actually turn it back over to Kyle. We're going to walk through the logic model all together and pull this thing together so you can see how it looks. So let me stop sharing.
So you all, it looks like great things are happening. George Kamensky, he has a question that Kyle shared that he would respond to a little bit later, but are we looking at universal, selected, or indicated population for the SOS case study is the question that will be responded to later.
Well, Nicole, you want to go ahead and pick that up? If LaShonda, if you're okay with that?
That works for me.
Okay. So if I got the question correctly, is the population identified as universal, selected, or indicated?
Gotcha. So can you all hear me okay? Making sure I'm
Good.
not on mute. All right. So it's a little bit of a mix here. So we have several things going on here. So when you're talking about those students who may have a positive screening and are then referred, that would be indicated, okay? And then there's another piece of this where we're doing an overall training so folks can identify the signs of depression and suicide. So that would be more universal, right, within the school. And if we chose to just focus on selected, let's say there were, not in this case, but let's say there were some of the kids maybe had a family member or something that had attempted suicide, they may be more in what's called a selected population. So they're not actually, they don't have a positive assessment, but they may be at a higher risk. So then they would be in this, that would be considered selected. So that's kind of how that would break down. But in this case, we're really looking at really universal and indicated based on the activities that we're doing here.
And I definitely echo with what Nicole just said. And I would say there may actually be 3 different objectives in that scenario, because many evidence-based practices have a universal component, a selected component, and an indicated component. And so what we see here on the screen before you that Nicole just laid out is the indicated piece for or an outcomes for those indicated populations. They were screened. They were found to have a high level of either a risk or a risk factor, or a low level of a protective factor. In this case, a risk factor. They were identified. They were given services, and simply because of that indicated survey result, that self-administered one. There definitely, as Nicole said, prior to one of this is if their friend group had somebody who committed suicide or actively sought to harm themselves, that might be the selected group, and there would be a different strategy that you would work with them. And then, of course, the universal means no harm, right? No matter who you are, you're not going to be harmed by having this. And that could be in our school, we're going to have a general assembly about mental health, and that it's okay not to feel good. And when you don't feel good, it's okay to let people know, right? Doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't identify anybody. It's just for everyone. And it is generally multiple levels of that you're going to see in these evidence-based programs now. They're trying to address each of those populations. So George, I hope that answers your question. If not, definitely ping us again or in the Q&A session. Nicole, anything you want to follow up with?
No, I think that's it. I'm excited to talk about all the linkages here, pulling it all together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one thing, if you pardon me one second, I'm going to go back one screen if you're okay.
Sure.
And I would just say for anybody who's kind of new to evaluation logic modeling, and Nicole already laid this out, we see this knowledge change here. And let me see. I kind of like this tool only because I just found it. But this knowledge piece, this laser pointer, I don't know if anybody can see it, but I see it. And
I see it.
I like it. Okay, good. All right. So we have knowledge, right? So when you talk about human behavior, usually to change human behavior, we have to change knowledge first. If I don't believe something, I don't listen, right? So I got to get a knowledge change to begin. And that's a beautiful short-term change, just like that stair step, right? I'm on my stair step. Yep. I now have knowledge. Smoking is bad for me. Other people feel bad too. I'm not alone, right? That's knowledge change. Now the question is, this intermediate can be a behavior, but there's actually an intermediate step that I use in a lot of my logic modeling. And again, not for SOS, but other programs, is attitude, right? Now I'm open to consider help, right? I'm not saying I'm going to get help, but I am now at least considering it. And I have survey results that go back and say, perception of harm is knowledge. And therefore, because it's harmful, I am considering using less, right? That's an attitude. Then we get into behavior. So if you ever stuck in a logic model, go back to the research on the evidence-based program, but don't forget it can be what I call the CAB, right? Knowledge, attitude, and behavior. So I have one of my objectives is knowledge, one of my objectives is attitude, one of my objectives is behavior change, which is the hardest one to get, right? I mean, just ask my wife. She's been trying to change my behavior for 30 years now. Hasn't worked, but she's still trying, bless her heart. All right. So that takes us to these linkages, right? So as we go through this piece, one of the things that's important to begin is to note that we have these priorities on the left-hand side that we talked about at the beginning of our presentation. We want to prevent and reduce adolescent suicide and suicide attempts. Our goal was to reduce those attempts. And again, the goal is high level, as Nicole said. We're not putting any percentages on there or even how measured. That's just the goal. And then our objectives are kind of what we just talked about, those stair steps, right? The knowledge, the attitude, behavior. In this case, knowledge, behavior, and behavior. Improve recognition of signs. Do we know that? Increase help-seeking behavior. Are you willing to do it? Are you okay? And do you know how to do it? And then that should, if we get all those things in place, reduce suicidal thoughts, right? And definitely suicidal actions. So those are our objectives. For each of those objectives, I'm going to have an outcome, and we'll talk about those in a second, that says as measured by. So improve recognition of signs of suicide by 30% after attending the Signs of Suicide presentation, as measured by self-administered SOS pre and post-test change. Right? So those are my priorities. Then I got to have these inputs, the things I have to have in order for this to occur. Well, I got to get the teaching materials, identify and adapt the screening tool. I got to train my clinical staff, and I got to obtain parental permission, right? Now, remember, if you're dealing with FERPA, and I know that this is a different presentation, but the OU has this for you if you need it, but you need to know the laws, because FERPA says if you're getting permission from parents and you're asking substance abuse or mental health questions, you also have to have an assent from students, right? So you'd have both of those, right? Consent from parents and the assent from the student to participate. So as you go through there, you have your inputs. Now, once I have my people trained and hired and I have the right one, what do? Well, they have to teach. And in my outputs, I normally put in numbers like teach 30 or teach 100 in the first year or teach the whole school, right? 620 students, how to recognize signs of depression and suicide. Now, why do I want that? Well, if something happens, a couple of years ago, we had swine flu. The second pandemic, just so you know, in the past 20 years was the swine flu, H1N1, and it shut schools down in Texas. And we had grants that were supposed to have done these activities that couldn't. So when we did our no cost extension, we were able to go back and say we were shut down. Instead of doing 10 of these, we could only do 5. And that's why we didn't have these outcomes. So we're able to go back and get funding through the no cost extension to do the missing components, right? So you want those numbers so you can track it. Use your outputs to your advantage when you're dealing with your funder. We want to model help-seeking behavior or our output, so we actually demonstrate that. And you need to kick out that Kyle character if he doesn't want to model it, right? If they sit back and say, oh, I know this, they don't need this, I'm more important than the curriculum, this part I can skip. No, don't do that. Get rid of the person, not the curriculum. The only thing that's evidence-based there is the curriculum. You can get rid of Kyle. And again, I'm just saying, Kyle, don't do that to your staff. Train, reinforce, help, right? But for me, just out the door. Number 3, assess for depression. And number 4, follow up and referral based on that assessment, right? So as we go through those processes, once I have these activities, these inputs, what do they do? And then the participants, right? Students and parents have to participate. So if I hold it, nobody shows up, what went wrong? How did I communicate? Students complete the assessment form, and then school staff refer at-risk students, and they need to know how to do that, and to do that in a proactive and pro-social manner. And according to the research, if we do all these things, if I'm a student and I feel supported and I have staff who train me and I have a support system around me that encourages it, when I feel bad and I feel depressed, then I should be able to go seek help. And if I do that, I should have improved recognition of the signs and symptoms of depression from my training. I should be able to seek that help because I've been taught how to do it and I've been supported in my actions to do it. Therefore, that hopefully will reduce future incidences of my suicidal thoughts since I'm getting help and support. which then is going to reduce my suicidal attempt. Now, that's the long-term goal, as Nicole mentioned multiple times. May not get that the first year or even the third year. We get that when we start talking about impact, right? Some cases that could be years down the line when we're talking about impact. For example, fetal alcohol syndromes and trying to reduce that number, it takes some time to get to that point. So as we move through it, that is kind of this logic model piece. If my priorities and my goals and objectives are right, and I have the right inputs after selecting an evidence-based strategy, and I do it correctly, which we call fidelity, which is the marriage of inputs and outputs, right? Because inputs have to equal the outputs. I got to have the inputs to make the output. I got to have the ingredients to make the cake. Then once that output, I put it in the oven, I can expect that the outcome is going to be that beautiful cake or that reduction in suicidal ideation, but at a minimum, an increase in recognition of signs and symptoms and an increase in willingness to seek help. What a great world that would be if we could just get to that point in many of our schools these days, right? So as you go through that process, that's what your logic model should do for you. It is not a playbook. It is not telling you this is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and how you do that. That's your strategy. That's your implementation plan. It's also not telling you the math. That's your evaluation plan that takes this and then says, how do you come up with those numbers? You can hire somebody specialized for that if you want to. This is just that high level that says, yeah, I understand that if I don't teach this, this outcome is probably going to be impacted. And if I can't teach it, if I don't have the teaching material, so you have to buy that for me first, right? So as you go through the process, it really just becomes this recipe of success. So as we move through it, that's really what we're trying to put together for you. The other thing I will leave you with before we get into kind of a little chat here with Nicole is don't be intimidated by statistical jargon and knowledge, right? At the end of the day, this should make sense for you. You know, if you are a loving, caring parent and you do things for your kids that help reduce risk factors and improve protective factors, you expect your children to have better outcomes. I know I do. If my kids are having an earache, right, I'm going to improve that earache because I'm going to make sure that they have enrolled in Medicaid if needed, or get them health insurance, and I'm going to get them to the doctor. But if the doctor prescribes me a prescription and it says give them this pill 3 times a day for 10 days, and I only give it to them once a day for 5 days, do I expect the same outcome? So again, puts everything together for us in a really logical way, high level way, but a way that allows it to make sense and for you to be able to track. And if the data isn't right and you come back and find out something's wrong, go backward and try to find out why. And it could be you hired me, right? So as you go through that process, you know what to do at that point in time. All right, I'm having fun with you. I'm going to turn this back over. I think Nicole and I are going to go into kind of a chat and answer some questions. Any questions at this point, LaShonda, or are we good?
It looks like I saw one additional question. Is skill development assessed? Was the other question.
Nicole, you want to start first?
Sure. So yeah, I think in terms of skills with SOS, I think that might be your question. Yeah, it would be giving them the skills, feeling confident to engage in help-seeking behavior. So that would be sort of the skill with this particular intervention. But in general, skills are going to be more applicable to your intermediate outcome. So think of the behavior and the skill kind of worked in there. I don't know if you had anything to add, Kyle.
Oh, you know me, I always do. It's a struggle. But at the end of the day, one of the things I would tell you is that it definitely could be. For example, we're going to train staff on how to model pro-social behavior or that modeling behavior. You may need to have a pre and post. And I use that because right now a big evidence-based strategy is screening, referral, and brief intervention, SBIRT. So screening and brief intervention and referral for treatment. And one of the things that we know is to do that, you usually use motivational interviews. And you have to train staff to do that. And what we designed then, and with the work of some of our customers, is to make sure there's a pre and post screening that shares and shows that they actually understand and can implement a motivational interview. And they actually tape themselves and they submit it to our motivational interview guru who certifies them. So yes, you can definitely add that. If that's a key and an important element in your evidence-based strategy, definitely include that. In this one, it definitely could be added because there was components there, particularly around the teachers modeling it, and then support, making sure our counselors understand what methods to use. So yes, it could be added and would be part of our logic model down the road, and would be a short-term outcome if needed, or even intermediate, depending on who you hire. Anything else?
I think you all have been cleared to proceed. The
Oh,
question, other than and while you're shifting to your appropriate slide deck, yes, you all, this is being recorded. The materials will be emailed to those who have registered for this event. So please note, if you have not registered for the event, the materials will not appear. So please, in the chat box, if you've not registered and would like to get a copy of the materials, please put your email address in the chat box.
all right. Well, as we move forward, then let's just talk real quickly about outputs and process measures. And some of the questions that have come up before is how will you know your activities happened as planned, right? Well, one of those is in those outputs, you should identify it. You should identify how many you're going to do, how often you're going to do it, and what the length of time is. And I always go back to intensity and duration, and it goes back to kind of the doctor's visit. We can never expect that our children, if we're giving a medication, is ever going to be good unless we do it with the intensity and duration prescribed by the doctor. We have to trust the doctor to begin with, and we have to trust the pharmacy and the pharmacist to get the right medication. But once you have those two, if it's 3 times a day for 10 days, you need to make sure that happens. And we can expect less or even bad results if we don't do that. Same thing happens in our activities. So one of the things that occurs is, what is our intensity and duration? If it says it needs to be 50 minutes of this, you need to make sure it's 50 minutes, not 30. Don't let Kyle talk super fast, right? And so as you move through it, I'm from Texas. I know I talk slow. I say that as a joke. But I did read some research somewhere that says people who talk fast actually have students who learn more because they are forced to pay attention. So I'm putting my head down on that peer-reviewed journal article. So as we go through here, just make sure it's done with fidelity and that you have that intensity and duration mapped out. So let's take a look real quickly then at this SOS process measure. We show the video to students and parents, discuss the video with students and parents, and distribute and collect self-administered surveys. So one of the things that I would probably add to that was just make sure that it's the full length video, right? Not just a shortened version of it. And that the discussion was full and broad and not truncated, that you were going to lunch and so therefore you only gave 2 minutes, that kind of thing. So the school summary results is how is it measured? We have the school summary form of questions, which students and parents saw the video. This might be also where you put in, did you learn something or what did you learn? Maybe even a pre-post. If you wanted to try that as an evaluator, I would probably advocate for that. But it doesn't mean you have to do it if it's not what the fidelity measures say you need to do. And then you could, with that data, you could come up with the percent of student body or parents seeing the video who actually discussed and assessed it. And one of the things that we're real big on nowadays is making sure that just because you showed up and you left 5 minutes later, that doesn't mean you participated, right? So one of the things is, did you stay for the entire time? So you want to be able to measure those. Another question we get is, how will you measure program produced changes, right? So one of the things that occurs in this process, we kind of addressed this in a couple of places, but for SOS as an example, it was going to be the survey, pre and post. So we're going to take Kyle's pre, look at his post, and see if it went up and down. In substance abuse, some cases, we look at it as surveys of the entire student population. That's okay, but it's not great because if I give everybody how many people thought of suicidal ideation, but I don't have a way of breaking it out by the individual, I really have just one person answering, which is the one school body who did it at the beginning of the year and the one school body who did it at the end of the year. And I can't tell how many people change behaviors. It's just one. So as you go through that process in SOS, we have student self-report on that 10 true false items about increase in knowledge and attitude. We have the student self-report. And then for youth and parent, we have the same thing there. So we have that survey that goes out. We also have the same thing as Nicole mentioned with intermediate and long-term measures, right? So we have the student self-report. We have decreases in suicidal ideation or the thoughts about suicide. We hope that goes down. Generally, the way it works, obviously, is you have to have the ideation before the action. And so if you can reduce ideation, you reduce the action or the attempt. And so as we go through that process, these are going to be self-reports. Now, some people chuckle at self-reports, but it's still some of the most reliable ways we have of getting data. Even to this date, SAMHSA, CDC, HHS, and others rely significantly on self-reports. Just remember, if you're dealing with self-reports, you have to build a bond. You have to have people know they can trust you with the data. You're not going to turn around and broadcast it on the news. You're not going to say, oh, look what Kyle said, right? You're going to be able to treat that with respect and dignity that everybody and every participant deserves. And if that comes across, then one of the things we have then, we pull it all together and we have this, right? Which we go back to, except now in my outcomes in my example, it would be improved recognition of signs and symptoms of depression and suicide by 30% for participants who completed the presentation as measured by the SOS pre and post test, right? Reductions in suicidal thoughts, or what we call ideation, by 15% for students who participated in the program as measured by self-report. So I would take the same objective and I would just add the percentages on the other side. So I'd take this would be the same here. I'd move it over here and I'd put as measured by, and then use the science behind it to tell me exactly why it's 30% or what it should be, what percentage decrease. Nicole, I am sure I missed something. I am sure you will update me on what it is that I confuse people with, as you always do and do such a good job with.
I thought you explained it really well, Kyle.
Oh, well, I'm going to write that down. I'm going to mark that on my calendar.
I thought you explained it really well. I don't see any questions that are coming through. LaShonda, did we have any questions?
Okay, so I want to follow up. There's been a question about why is everyone placing their email in the chat box? So only the people who have not registered should place their name in the chat box. So if somebody sent you the link and said you really need to go to this logic model training today and you didn't register for the event, please place your email address in the chat box. That'll ensure that you get access to the materials that you've seen here today. And also just a quick reminder, we are recording this event, and so you'll also receive a copy of the recording as well. We did have one question, and the question, as I go, if family / social circle is not supportive, then which of the steps needs to be changed or fixed? And so, Pashmeen, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your question. If you mean just sort of in general, in terms of prevention, or what needs to be fixed in the logic model, that would help us a little bit.
Yeah, hi, Pashmeen here. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you, Pashmeen.
Yeah, so in the logic model, what need to be fixed, because we are already talking about suicidal and ideation and everything. So what exactly need to be fixed to overcome that obstruction or that problem?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll let Nicole follow up after me if you're okay with that, Nicole.
Sure.
One of the things that we know of is that in mental health field and in the fields that we work in, there's a lot of things dependent on the parents and parent permission and parental consent. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rules related to emergency medical services. Mental health and suicidal ideation can fall into that. The issue at that point in time, if a parent says, for example, Pashmeen, that I do not want them participating in this program whatsoever, there's very little follow-up that can be done in my experience, legally for a school district to put a child into a program that a parent has expressly said that they can't. And so as you go through the process, the way that can work, though, and the workaround for that would be is to try to educate the parents on the need for the program. But also remember is that student is still part of a larger body. And as long as that social environment is changed that is supportive of that student, and if there is a cry out for mental health, you're going to get help to that student in a crisis and then call parents. So as long as that support system is in place. But if you truly have it, I've had it a couple of cases with some of the programs we worked with, particularly around substance abuse. They said, nope, that child is mine. I will teach that child how and when they can drink, and I don't want you doing any of it. They actually had to sit out the programs in which there was curriculum related to it. But that's how you work around it, is you try to work with the parent directly, and then you put the support systems around the student. Nicole, what do you think?
I think you covered it well, and I know we're getting short on time, Kyle, so I'm gonna turn the time over to LaShonda, who I think is ready to kind of pull this all together.
Sure, putting it all together takes us right to where we are, which are at the question stage of the game. And so hopefully you all can see my screen currently. I'm also looking for more questions. There was a question from, I like how I can't find this question now. I'm sorry. A question from Jennifer Gormley. So the outputs plus the process measures equals the actual outcomes.
Yeah, at a high level way, yes. If you think about it, if I have all these activities or all these inputs and I purchase them, and I have all, and that includes the people, and I do the outputs together, then that's going to actually equal that outcome, right? Because I have to have this plus this for this to occur. And remember, there's a lot of outputs. Just like baking a cake, you got to put it in the oven for so long at this temperature, but that becomes the outcome. And if it doesn't, then you need, the first step is, did I have the right inputs and outputs? That's where I first go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. You all, and we do know that during this question and answer period, sometimes folks have more time than others. If you would, again, Sheila, add the evaluation to the chat box, folks, please don't leave us without doing an evaluation of this service today. We will carry on with answering a question from the rule team. The question is, can you add the logic model structure example links in the chat? Okay, so can we add the logic model structure example links in the chat? I'm not quite sure what.
Yeah, I think, LaShonda, we do have the links to the Robert Wood Johnson and the
Yes.
Kellogg's. I think so. And I think we could, yep, there we go.
So there they are on the screen right now. So resources on logic modeling, the University of Wisconsin Extension. This is an old training. They say oldie but a goodie, like my dog. She's about 13 years old. She's an oldie, but she is a goodie. Yep. This is one you will not want to miss. The University of Wisconsin's Extension's online course. It's 24/7. You can get in there at any time and start messing around with creating a logic model until you get that intensive TA for the third portion of this series. Also, the Kellogg Foundation's Logic Model Guide. It's also another great guide. It's been around for a while as well, an oldie but a goodie. And then University of Kansas's Community Toolbox also has some samples. What you'll find within those resources are templates for creating logic models, definitions of the anatomy of those logic models, and as well as examples of logic models. So you will indeed find a plethora of resources. And then you'll find on this slide, these are the references for today. As always, we want you all to connect with us. So there's lots of ways you can connect with us. One of those ways is through our newsletter that comes out the third Wednesday of each month. So please sign up for our newsletter to learn more about trainings that we have to offer. You can also download resources from our website. We have a pandemic response resource. So just take a look at our website at pttcnetwork.org. And again, here's the feedback. We certainly appreciate your time today. Please fill out our evaluation to let us know how we're doing. And if you have any more questions, my name is LaShonda Williamson Jennings. I'm the co-director of the South Southwest PTTC. My email address is lwilliamson@ou.edu. Please sign up for the next session, which is the Learning Lab, and that'll help you get an opportunity to enjoy some intensive TA. Also, another reason for going to our website, you all, is that in talking about signing up, that's where you register. You can register for this webinar on our website. Also, once the materials are available, we're going to place those materials as well as today's recording on our website. So pttcnetwork.org is a great resource. pttcnetwork.org. Thank you all so much, Kyle and Nicole. As George Kamensky says, excellent presentation, and I certainly agree with you all. Have a good afternoon.